welcome, gentlemen, to the Daily Show.
Thank you, thank you.
Great to see you again, but let's jump into this book, which a lot of people would think, would see the cover and go like, why would I read this? Racism, anti-racism, and you. The first thing you say is, this is not a history book. What does that mean?
Look, I chose to start the book that way because this book is geared toward younger people, and younger people don't like to read history books.
Right.
And so you start off by saying, don't worry, this is not a history book, and then you open doke them, right? And the other part of it though is that we talk about history as if it's in a bubble. But the truth is that history is perennial. It runs through our lives every single day. And it's
Right.
more about it being a present book that history actually impacts.
That's really interesting because that has been fascinating reading through this. I didn't know what to expect. You know, you read books that tell you about the history of America, you read books that only focus on racism today or maybe even Jim Crow, but this book really just takes you through everything in a way that seems like it's palatable. Like, has it been designed in such a way that you can just read it and understand without feeling too much? Is that what you've tried to do for younger readers?
I mean, racism is historical. And what that means is it's rooted in the past, but you can constantly see it operating in
Right.
your daily life, and you can constantly see how it's going to operate tomorrow. And that's what we wanted to sort of show for young people, that this history book is in the present. It's operating in the future, so they can understand their everyday lives.
When you wrote the book, you know, the two of you came together, Jason and Ibram, and you worked on this, telling this story of racism, and you have such short chapters in the book, which is really interesting. It doesn't follow the formats of a normal book. Sometimes a chapter is 10 pages, sometimes it's longer, sometimes the way you write on a page, like the words pop out, they change. It really does engage you in a certain way. Were you trying to break the mind and how it's consuming information when you created the book?
For sure, but I'm also trying to make sure that we're working with the realities of young folks, which is an overstimulated world, right? I can't compete with cell phones, video games, YouTube, Fortnite, and all these things that they
Yes.
have going on with their lives every single day. My job isn't to compete, though. That's a silly and futile argument. My job is to work with those things by creating multiple stimuli within the pages of the book. Why not?
Why? That's brilliant. I think without even realizing it, you might have hit on another opportunity. You just add like an expansion onto Fortnite that just teaches you about racism.
Exactly.
So you have like skins from the past, and then kids can learn. There's like challenges.
Don't you?
That's next up.
Ibram, young people are going to read this book, and some of them may feel deflated. They may go like, man, racism was so bad back then, so bad during slavery, so bad during Jim Crow, segregation, etc. And it feels like it's so bad today. How can I maintain hope in this world? You know, whether as a black kid or whether as a kid who's not black and going like, I'm an ally, I want this world to be a better place.
So that's why we didn't just want to write a history about racism. We wanted to write a history about anti-racism. We wanted to show them how people have been fighting against anti-racism from its origins. And people are fighting against it today, and they can be a part of that fight. And here is essentially how people have done it in the past, here how they've been affected, and here's how you can be affected today.
When you look through the stories, when you dig into the history of racism, does it have, the way we understand racism today, does it have a definitive start date? Is there a moment in time, or is it just an evolution of people hating each other because they're not the same?
So there is a start date, the transatlantic slave trade. You know, that's when you had all these different ethnic groups in Africa that were imagined as one people, one inferior people that was worthy of enslavement, and then simultaneously the racist policies that undergirded the transatlantic slave trade. And we talk about these original racists in the text, and young people are like, whoa, there was like original first racist I had never knew.
Remember,
And, you know, that's one of the
remember what his name
fascinating things
was?
to think about this text.
One thing you
Zurara,
do really well
our
in the
very
book, in my
first
opinion, is
racist.
you break it down so that people can see what is oftentimes underlying racism, or a racism that some people may not even realize that they have been indoctrinated into. You know, you talk about the Southern strategy. You talk about how Nixon and many Republicans realized that they couldn't just say these things. They couldn't call black people the N-word outwardly. They had to say ghettos, and they had to say thugs, and those the code words and language that was used. When breaking that down for kids, do you think that'll help them understand some of those implications that are still in place today?
I do think that breaking it down will help them sort of grapple with it and understand. But I also think that we can create new code, right? And so what I'm saying is that this book, the intention of this book is to create new code, right? Anti-racist is a new code, right? For a person who's really fighting for true equity,
Right.
for true love. right? And I think that's our real task. People talk about indoctrination all the time. This idea that like, oh, I don't want this book in my classroom because it's indoctrination. Well, isn't everything? So what if we were able to create new indoctrination for equity and justice?
Wow. I love this. I've never read about history like this. I've never read about the now like this, and it really breaks racism down into a beautiful way that I think kids of all races will enjoy. Thank you so much for being on the show. I hope everybody reads it. It should be in every school. I'll tell you that much. Thank you so much for being on the show. Steph is available now. You really want to go out and get it. Jason Reynolds and April Next 10, everybody.
Alright, what I really liked about that interview was that Ibram talked about how it's a history of anti-racism. We're learning about anti-racists throughout history, what they have done, and what continues to happen. That's something that we're going to go over today, is some of the continuation of that. And so that's something that I really took from this interview. And I hope that you guys took a little bit from this interview, because there was some new information that we hadn't heard from our previous interviews. So I hope you like that. I like The Daily Show. I think Trevor's a good interviewer. So, to go over what we're going to go over today, warm up, we did our vote, and we listened to the interview.
We'll have Miles real quick to catch you up. What we did is we decided that we were going to have two separate groups
Just tomorrow.
just tomorrow. And Group A was going to finish Dear Martin with Miss Broadus in here with the audio on. And the other group was going to come with me outside, and we are going to do just our own personal summary of the book and discuss other possible young adult literature that could be used instead of Dear Martin. So is she have an orange sticky?
Yeah, there's an orange sticky.
Sticky right there. So just, on your desk right in front of you, that one right there. Just put if you would rather be in Group A and finish the book in class, or if you'd want to be in Group B and do a somewhat different assignment outside. You still get the same credit regardless of what group you pick. But we were just talking about yesterday and how important your guys' reflections were, and feelings and discussions, and we really want to use that as a learning experience for not only you guys, but for us as well as educators. And we feel that teaching about history, real history, Black history, white history, is important and should continue to be taught. I am new to teaching it, so everything is always kind of a working creation, right? And you guys help make that happen. So that's kind of where we're moving on from yesterday. So everybody feels they have a voice, and to what degree they want to take in the information. Does that make sense? Okay.
Alright, so just to go over our schedule today, we did the vote, we listened to the interview, that's our warm-up. We're gonna listen to a couple other videos today that I find are important. We're gonna listen about W.E.B. Du Bois, because he comes up in our STAMP chapter. We don't read about him, but we read about how he influenced Martin Luther King. So I want to just do a little tiny biography about him. Then we're going to listen to a small video about the SNCC, or SNCC. I just wanted you to have an idea of what that group meant and represented, because that also comes up in our book. We'll read our chapters 20. We're going to read about 5 minutes of chapter 22, and then we're going to do our notes together. So that's going to be our plan for this morning. Hopefully that will bring us to our mask break, or close to a mask break. Then we'll come back. We'll watch a couple other videos about Angela Davis because she's also an important figure in the book that we don't get to read about her full life story. And we're going to listen to chapter 28. So that's going to happen after our break. Just to give you a little schedule for today. We're also going to do an exit slip today. I know that we haven't done that in the last couple days, but I do want to make sure that we get one today because we're going to learn a lot of information. I want to know what you guys are taking in and your opinion about today.
And there's two quick quotes I want to just kind of cover with you guys. I know I said this one, which was on the board earlier. To know the past is to know the present. To know the present is to know yourself, by Jason Reynolds. And this is my favorite quote by Martin Luther King. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. And this talked to me so much when I was going in my head with everything that happened yesterday. And I didn't just want to go silent. I wanted us to continue to learn and experience and express.
Awesome. So we're going to watch this video. It's very short, but just gives us a little taste about WEB.
William Edgar Burghardt Du Bois, better known as W.E.B. Du Bois, lived a very long life and was the singular, towering intellectual figure of African American life in the 20th century. He was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts in 1868 and died in 1963 in Accra, Ghana. He was one of the first advocates of using academic knowledge in the service of civil rights and social change. With his PhD dissertation, he is taking on the entire edifice of sociology in the social scientific community, pointing out fallacies in the relationship between received wisdom about the races, about black people in particular, and the way that that information is mythologized in statistics on crime or birth rates. Du Bois worked tirelessly to position himself at a university or at what we would consider think tanks today in order to have the financial support and the platform to make a difference. Eventually, he found his way to the editor of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, the NAACP's New Crisis magazine, published in 1911. And for over 20 years, he used that as his perch to describe every facet of the race problem. He was also an early Pan-Africanist and participated in the earliest Pan-African gatherings in London, here in the United States, and drawing together people of African descent all over the world to change the balance of power, to throw off the yoke of colonialism and the human rights abuses here in this country. And when it came to the Harlem Renaissance, when it came to the New Negro movement, he parlayed all of those networks, all of those ideas, his facility in both social scientific work, his literary production, to prove with the power of the pen and the power of the voice and the power of organizing that black people could and would transform this world, not just for black people, but for democracy.
My job is to make college easy.
So he was a very important figure during his time. He was the first black man to get a PhD from Harvard, and he used his education to try to combat ideas that were prevalent during that time. And we learn in our chapter stamp today that Martin Luther King learned a lot from WEB and used some of the similar ideas in his time of being a civil rights leader. Now this next video, we're just going to watch part of it, but like I said, I just want you to know what this organization was about because it's brought up in our chapter.
We stood for a more democratic society.
Nonviolent organizers,
We stood for the right of people to be human.
aggressive justice.
Let the people decide.
The letters SNCC stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Commonly called SNCC for its initials.
SNCC was founded in April 1960 to serve as an effort to bring together all the young people who have been participating in sit-ins across the South.
These students were Southern students. They were not going to live like their parents and their grandparents lived.
We accepted nonviolence, not simply as a technique, as a tactic, but as a way of life, as a way of living.
If I'm in a picket line and someone comes up and strikes me, I'm not going to strike him back. If I'm marching down the street in a protest march and someone spits at me, I'm not going to spit back at him.
People that were prepared and willing to go into hell's fire.
Well, my trouble is hard, so hard. Well, my trouble is hard, so hard.
SNCC's job was to facilitate whatever these students needed. If they went to jail, it was to find a way to get them out of jail. SNCC's job was not to dictate to these communities what their movement was about. The organization really just did the coordination to support all of these student activities that happened from Nashville all through the Carolinas into Georgia. I didn't want to go. I was too afraid. But it was like, if I'm going around on campuses telling people that they should help in the South and I don't do it, what kind of hypocrite am I? So I ended up there and developed a whole literacy project.
It was very hard.
So this organization, like they said in the video, didn't plan or push people in a certain direction. They just helped coordinate what was already happening, which is the non-violent protests such as the sit-ins that were happening throughout the South. So I just wanted you to have a little information about this because it's going to come up and they don't always explain it in the chapter. So I wanted you to have it for yourself. Would you like to plug in for 20? Okay.
Audible has given us a little bit of
They are
issues.
giving me some issues today. I tried to get it to work and I don't know if it'll reach me anymore.
Alright guys, so right now what I'd like everybody to do, hey Scott, can you wake up for me, bud? Scott, thank you. So we're gonna be going through your stamped book. So if you can open up the book and follow along, we're obviously gonna have the audio as well, but a lot of times it helps to look at what is being discussed. If you would like to highlight or underline, or if you have any questions while we're going through each chapter. We also have Mr. Taylor here with us today, just to make sure that we have any sort of questions, concerns, issues, ideas. So everybody has the ability to feel comfortable and that you're getting all the information that you're interested in.
And we're on page 155.
155.
Chapter 20. Home is where the hatred is. World War II. I know this isn't supposed to be a history book, but abroad. The Double V campaign kicked the civil rights movement into high gear, and as World War II neared its end in April 1945, W.E.B. Du Bois joined representatives of 50 countries at the United Nations Conference on International Organization in San Francisco. He wanted the new United Nations Charter to become a buffer against racism. Then, later in the year, Du Bois attended the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England. Pan-Africanism is a movement that encourages solidarity among all people of African descent. Strength in numbers, global power, that was the key. At the 5th conference in 1945, Du Bois was fittingly introduced as the father of Pan-Africanism. In attendance were 200 men and women, including Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Kenya's Jomo Kenyatta, young revolutionaries who would go on to lead the African decolonization movements which were meant to remove colonial leaders. These delegates did not make the politically racist request of past Pan-African Congresses of gradual decolonization, as if Africans were not ready to rule Africans. And what I mean when I mention Africans ruling Africans is Africans governing themselves. Imagine that. It must have felt like a bomb dropped on the heads of racist Europeans. Those weren't the only bombs dropping. The United States emerged from World War II, looked over at the ravaged European and East Asian worlds and flexed its unmatched capital, industrial force, and military arms as the new global leader. The only problem was America, the land of the free, home of the brave, still had a race problem. And that race problem was starting to affect its relationships around the world. American freedom wasn't free, hell, it wasn't even real. But no matter what compromises President Harry Truman, who took over after Roosevelt died in 1945, tried to make, the South always fought back. I almost don't want to tell you what happened because I've told you what happened a lot already, but if you were to guess that white people started to perpetuate lies about black people being inferior to keep the world of racism spinning, you'd be right. On February 2nd, 1948, Truman urged Congress to implement the Civil Rights Act despite the lack of support among white Americans. You can imagine the outrage. Many left the Democratic Party, others stayed and formed what they called the Dixiecrats, who, in order to fight back against Truman's push for civil rights, ran a man named Strom Thurmond for president. It was a grossly segregationist platform. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Black voters made sure Truman won. And once he did, his administration brought forth a few game-changing civil rights cases. 1. Shelley versus Kramer, 1948. The case was decided with the Supreme Court determining that the courts could not enforce whites-only real estate contracts in northern cities to keep out migrants and stop housing segregation. This brought on the open housing movement, which basically exposed white people stopping black people from living where they wanted to live. The fear was the same old fear, that black people would make the neighborhoods dangerous, that their white daughters would be in danger, that the property value would go down. Some black people wanted to live in white neighborhoods for validation. Some black people were just looking for better housing options. Some white people were so afraid they literally packed up and left their homes. White flight. 2. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. I'm sure you've heard of this one. If you live in the South and go to a diverse school, this is why. This was the case that said racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The results, schools began to mix. What's really interesting about this case, though, something rarely discussed, is that it's actually a pretty racist idea. I mean, what it basically suggests is that black kids need a fair shot, and a fair shot is in white schools. I mean, why weren't there any white kids integrating into black schools? The assumption was that black kids weren't as intelligent because they weren't around white kids, as if the mere presence of white kids would make black kids better. Not true. A good school is a good school, whether there are white people there or not. Oh, and of course people were pissed about this. People were pissed about them both. And pissed people do pissed things. A year later, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till was brutally murdered in Money, Mississippi for supposedly hissing at a white woman. They beat Till so ruthlessly that his face was unrecognizable during his open casket funeral in his native Chicago. The gruesome pictures were shown around the enraged black world at the request of his mother. And though supremacists in power continued to blame Brown v. Board of Education for the problems, young Emmett's death lit a fire under the civil rights movement led by a young, charismatic preacher from Atlanta who idolized W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr.
Can we stop for a
There was a
second?
youthful energy to the movement. A new
I just wanna share a few things with that. So he brought up the fact that they were questioning why whites didn't immigrate into the black schools. And I don't think that's a fair assumption. The reason why the whites weren't gonna integrate into the black schools was because the black schools didn't have the books that they needed. They didn't have the teaching that they needed. That's why the black kids had to go to the white schools. So to answer that question, because he kind of threw it out there, but doesn't tell you why. And I think that's a big important thing. That's why the blacks integrated into the white schools, was to get the better education. Not that they couldn't be educated, or not that they weren't smart. The education wasn't in the black schools at that time.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I love this book, but a lot of times he just sometimes gives us just enough information, or not always the details, or we have questions or interests after. So, any other questions? Yes.
I was just saying when Reynolds said that, it kind of pissed me off.
Say that again?
When Reynolds said that, it kind of pissed me off.
Okay.
And I'll give you guys a little story on the Emmett Till thing. My great uncle Talmadge was actually with Emmett Till when that took place. And the story behind that isn't all necessarily true either. Emmett Till actually wasn't even the one that whistled. It was my great uncle. And they were my great uncle. They're from Mississippi. They migrated back up here to Chicago. They stopped in St. Louis on the way up. But what happened was, when that happened, they were told that my uncle was going to get lynched. They moved. They left. And Emmett hadn't left yet. And that's who they got because he was with. Right. And so there's a lot of story. There's a lot that goes with that story that people don't tell either, that I've been fortunate to hear, only because part of the reason why I'm here is because of some of the stuff that happened in the past.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. Any questions? Interest? Anything before we continue? Okay. Yes,
A
please.
new
Let us
wave.
know if we need to stop anytime.
A new way of doing things, and Du Bois loved watching it grow more and more powerful. He was now 90 years old and hopeful. He never stopped struggling, and Dr. King was cut from similar cloth. He and Du Bois had not let up, and neither had college students. 4 black freshmen at North Carolina A&T entered a Woolworths in Greensboro on February 1st, 1960. They sat down at the whites-only counter where they were denied service and stayed there until the store closed. Within days, hundreds of students from area colleges and high schools were sitting in. News reports of these nonviolent sit-ins flashed on TV screens nationally, setting off a sit-in wave to desegregate Southern businesses. By April, students were staging sit-ins in 78 Southern and border communities, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, had been established. These college kids were like new Negroes. They weren't waiting for white saviors, not in politicians like John F. Kennedy, who was running for office, or writers like Harper Lee, whose novel To Kill a Mockingbird was basically the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the civil rights movement. Don't mind if I don't. Nope. No white saviors for them. But they also weren't interested in being black saviors. They weren't necessarily saving themselves, they were just being themselves. But the thing about being black is that just being can bring bloodshed. And that's what Dr. King and the SNCC and the civil rights movement as a whole were banking on. The vicious violence in response to the nonviolent civil rights movement was embarrassing the country all around the non-white world. On April 3rd, 1963, King helped kick off a series of demonstrations in Birmingham, bringing on the wrath of the city's ruggedly segregationist police chief, Bull Connor. 9 days later, on Good Friday, 8 white anti-segregationist Alabama clergymen signed a public statement requesting that these unwise and untimely street demonstrations end. Martin Luther King Jr., jailed that same day, read the statement from his cell. Angry, he started doing something he rarely did. He responded to critics in his letter from Birmingham jail, published that summer. No one knows whether the sickly W.E.B. Du Bois read King's jailhouse letter, but just as Du Bois had done in 1903 and later regretted, in his letter King erroneously conflated two opposing groups, the anti-racists who hated racial discrimination and the black separatists who hated white people in groups like the Nation of Islam. King later distanced himself from both, speaking to a growing split within the civil rights movement. More and more battle-worn young activists were becoming frustrated with King's nonviolence and were more often listening to Malcolm X's sermons. Malcolm X was a minister of the Nation of Islam, a religious organization focused on the liberation of black people through discipline, self-defense, community organizing, and a fortified understanding of who black people were regardless of white people's opinions. He preached that blacks were the original people of the world, which pushed back against the Bible and the early theories of white Egypt. He also preached black self-sufficiency, that black people could care for themselves, their families, and their communities all by themselves. Sure, he was a polarizing force, but he was also an anti-racist persuading away assimilationist ideas. On May 3rd, 1963, the young folks that followed leaders like Malcolm watched on television as Bull Connor's vicious bloodhounds ripped to pieces the children and teenagers of black Birmingham who had been following Dr. King. As Connor's fire hoses broke limbs, blew clothes off, and slammed bodies into storefronts, and as his officers clubbed marchers with nightsticks, the world watched too. On June 11th, President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation, or the world rather, and summoned Congress to pass civil rights legislation. Today, we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free, Kennedy said. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. With the eyes of the globe on him, Kennedy, who really didn't have much of a choice, introduced civil rights legislation. But it didn't stop the momentum of the long-awaited March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Though it had been organized by civil rights groups, the Kennedy administration controlled the event, ruling out civil disobedience. Kennedy aides approved the speakers and speeches, no black women, no James Baldwin, an openly gay black novelist who'd become a bold and brilliant political voice through his writings, and no Malcolm X. On August 28th, approximately 250,000 activists and reporters from around the world marched to the area between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, and King closed the day with what's probably the most iconic speech of all time, "I Have a Dream." But there was bad news. W.E.B. Du Bois had died in his sleep the previous day. Indeed, a younger Du Bois had called for such a gathering, hoping it would persuade millions of white people to love the lowly souls of black folk. And yes, the older Du Bois had chosen another path, the anti-racist path less traveled, toward forcing millions to accept the equal souls of black folk. It was the path of civil disobedience that the young marchers in the SNCC and CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, also responsible for much of the nonviolence training for the movement, had desired for the March on Washington, a path a young woman from Birmingham's Dynamite Hill was already traveling and would never leave. But Roy Wilkins, one of Dr. King's right-hand men and the bearer of the bad news, did not dwell on the different paths. Looking out at the lively March on Washington, he just asked for a moment of silence to honor the 95-year-old movement of a man.
Okay, so there's a lot in that chapter, and we're gonna go through some notes together to help us better just go over kind of summarizing some of the things in the story, also helping us with some comprehension. And if we have any questions, please ask them. Any comments?
So everyone wants to open up their computers.
Yes, sorry, open up your computers.
Yep.
It's called Chapter 20. And the chapter is called Home is Where the Hatred Is. It's in your modules under Stamped. So if we look in our book on page 158, what were two major court cases that happened and changed American society in the 29th century? Page 158.
You guys wanna recheck? 'Cause I know there was a lot going on, if you look
Yeah.
on page 158, so
Maya,
lots to
can you
just
give me one?
try to remember.
158.
And you guys, if you look, they're right here, they're kind of written a little bit different, they're italicized, so you just look real quick.
Shelley versus Kramer. That was talking about the courts determining that the courts could not enforce white-only real estate contracts in northern cities to keep out migrants and stop housing desegregation. So that's a big court case for that time. Shelley v. Kramer, and I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger for you guys.
The second court case is right under that.
Yeah, it's right underneath it on page 158. It has to do with education.
Who had heard the name before of the student? Edmund Hill?
Well, Emmett Till's not part of that.
Oh, no, that's right, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry.
Yeah, that's our next question.
Yes.
It's Brown v. Board of Education. That's a very important court case for education in our country. It's a case that said racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional.
Can you pull it up maybe a little bit more?
A little more.
There we go, perfect. Alright, can everybody see that okay?
So, Emmett Till was a young black boy. He was really young, and he was beaten to death after an incident where someone whistled at a white woman. And as Mr. Taylor said, it wasn't even Emmett who whistled, or as they said in the book, hissed at the white woman, but he was unfortunately killed. And the new movement that began as a result of this from the book is the civil rights movement during that time. There were people that were fighting for anti-racist things at that time. It's not like this was a brand new thing, but when it asked what movement started, it says, Emmett's death lit a fire under the civil rights movement.
Quick thing I wanted to mention, you guys, that this was brought up a couple times, and Mr. Taylor, I want to kind of ask your opinion about this because this was talked about in class. So our author, Jason Reynolds, gave us 3 important words that he talks about through all the chapters. He talks about the segregationists, which he said were the haters, the racists, the assimilationists, who were the people who loved you because you were like them. So the people who would tell black people to act white, right? And then you had the anti-racists who were loving you for who you are and fought for you. When we watched the interview, what I took it as him explaining, kind of just breaking it down to these 3 simple categories, was his way of saying, yes, there was racism from the beginning, but there was kind of always somebody who was either an assimilationist, who then eventually you get the anti-racists. Would you say that's a correct thought as to why the author takes these 3 words into account throughout the whole book? Okay, so these are the 3 things he brings up in every chapter, and even in an interview about the segregationists, the assimilationists, and the anti-racists. And some students didn't really like just those 3 ways of saying, well, there isn't just, assimilationists, it's all a form of racism. And why are we calling the segregationists just racists? To me, looking at his interview and what different interviews we've heard from Jason Reynolds, he's saying it wasn't, especially back then, it wasn't that simple. You would have your group who is always trying to fight in some way, shape, or form for black rights, even back in the 1400s. And that's why he keeps these 3 categories throughout the whole book.
I personally feel like, and me personally, simulation, like, at that earlier time, it was you're racist or you're
an anti-racist.
I don't really think there was anything in between, because my thing is, if I'm looking at somebody and saying, hey, I don't really have a problem with you if you act like I do, then, and you behave as I do, and the people that are around me, then you're okay. Well, no, I'm my own person, so that person might not necessarily be considered a racist, but you're definitely not an anti-racist, is what I would think.
So like Thomas Jefferson, he categorizes as an assimilationist. You won't ever call him, per se, a racist.
Well, I have my own thoughts on Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
So,
Right, but it's just, these are things that we're picking up, and I just kind of wanted your perspective, because I think it's really important to hear your perspective on that, because like I said, to me, this was a new way of looking at it to me. It wasn't just, he wasn't just going with this literally black versus white, like racist, anti-racist. He was saying, well, there was all this gray parts.
There were great parts, and those people who were fighting, but they couldn't come out and say they were fighting.
Okay.
They could not do that, which, I guess to me, today, if I have people who won't support me publicly, then we've had this discussion as our staff. If you're not supporting me publicly, then you're really not supporting me.
Right.
And you telling me how much you care about me behind closed doors does nothing for me.
Right.
How do I believe that?
Yeah.
So, I get there could be some gray, but I lean more towards that time, you were a racist or you were a non-racist and anti-racist then at that time. Now, have things changed a little bit? That's where I say, like, in my time as a kid, that's where it started to change, because kids weren't necessarily, like, the kids that I went to school weren't necessarily racist, but their parents were.
Got it.
And they had, like, they were playing fine lines with stuff. So, they could hang out with me, but they couldn't date me. They could hang out with my brother and sister, but they couldn't date them. Well, you could only hang out with them at certain times, but the kids never felt, like, most of the kids never really felt that way. Like, no, I'm good with you, however.
Right.
And that's where I see, for the gray area of that switching. And then even today, I asked some of the kids that I went to school with that now have biracial children, well, how do your parents deal with it? Because I know how they are.
Yeah.
And it kind of forces them to have to look at things a little differently. Like, well, it's my grandchild. That's a little different. But I also know some that said, nope, I don't have anything to do with you. Like, so. But at the time, back in the time, I think it was more racist, anti-racist kind of. I feel that way. So.
Okay.
Okay.
Alright, thank you.
Thanks. All right, so I want to hear from you guys. What ways did the civil rights movement groups, these young college students in the South, how did they demonstrate? What did they do? Greg, do you remember? No? Maya Little, do you know?
What did that group do? What was so amazing about that group? Or what was such hard work about that group? What did they do when they marched? Or what didn't they do?
They weren't violent.
They weren't
They
violent.
had non-violent protests. They had sit-ins. They had marches. That's how they demonstrated. And there was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, that helped coordinate those types of demonstrations and didn't push them in either direction, but just helped in facilitating what happened before, during, and after those types of demonstrations. So they marched and they held sit-ins. Non-violent. And many of these non-violent demonstrations were met with violence.
Yes, and this is very, I think this is very important for everybody who's a part of this, is understand when certain people put together these non-violent sit-ins and things like that at that time, the people who were putting together knew it was gonna be a violent situation. Which there are a lot of people who struggle with that, because we call it non-violent, but we knew it was going to be violent. They were just pretty much told to deal with that and take it, to make it look a certain way. So they call it non-violent, but they walked into it knowing it was gonna be violent, and they were just kind of giving themselves up for the cause at that point. And I think that's super important, for many reasons down the road. It's really, really important. And if you guys ever want to know that aspect of it, I'll be happy to share it. But they were walking into it knowing it was going to be violent, and they called it non-violent, and they just gave themselves up for the cause, and they took the beatings. Some lost their lives over it. I shouldn't say the people did know.
The marchers were not violent, but it didn't mean the people around them who were disagreeing with the march didn't become violent.
Well, the marchers were not violent, and the marchers didn't think they were going into something that would turn violent. The people who organized the marches, the leaders, were very aware that it was going to turn violent, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And to me, there's a lot of reasons why that bothers me, because you're saying it's a non-violent thing, but you're sending these people who think it's going to be a non-violent thing into something that you know is gonna be violent. And they just have to kind of deal with it.
Okay.
And those organizers weren't part of the march. They were just kind of in the back saying, hey, don't do this. Whatever you do, just be peaceful. But take the beating, take everything else that comes with it. So, and again, huge importance for that. And I can explain to you how I know that information as well down the road.
And you don't get to hear that part.
Yeah, no.
That part's never talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, thank you for that. I appreciate your input. What are the two? Yes.
Why we don't got heat up in this school?
Heat it up.
No, why we don't have heat up in the school?
Because I think the temperature keeps going back and forth. Like it gets hot, then it gets cold, then it gets hot, then it gets cold.
It's really cold up in this classroom every day.
Yeah, this classroom is kind of colder than classrooms, but
Maybe we can fix that by closing the windows.
For COVID purposes, we keep the windows open because it keeps the air circulating. So,
who were two of the main people that we talked about in this chapter? As leaders of civil rights groups at this time, we talked about two of them.
two big names.
And we talked about them before in class.
I'll raise my hand.
Oh yeah,
you
sorry,
did.
go
I thought
ahead.
you said-
Malcolm X.
Malcolm X,
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King.
Absolutely.
Nice job.
Sorry, and I didn't know if you were stretching or not, so I didn't call on you. So I appreciate you telling me that you were raising your hand.
It was a hand raise that moved into a stretch.
And one of the things I wanted to point out is on page 162. It's towards the middle of the page, kind of towards the end in this area. Malcolm X was a minister in the Nation of Islam, a religious organization focused on the liberation of black people through discipline, self-defense, community organizing, and a fortified understanding of who black people were, regardless of white people's opinion. So I wanted to make sure that we understood those characteristics.
I got a question.
Yes.
Can you like repeat that again?
Yeah, I can definitely repeat it again. So the first one is through discipline. So that's our first bullet point, discipline. Self-defense. Community organizing.
Community.
Organizing. And this last one's longer, so I'll put it up here too. A fortitude, or a fortified understanding of who black people were, regardless of white people's opinions.
And then after we do this, we'll take a mass break.
Yes. Can you read that okay, everyone?